Hi everyone, and welcome to this online CPD session entitled What is Biodiversity Net Gain? I'm really glad that you've decided to take some time today to learn a bit more about the subject of biodiversity net gain and what it means for you. I think there should be quite a broad range of viewers, so I'll try and speak quite generally. And then you can feel free to get in touch to ask about more specific points if you have any queries. My email address is on this screen and I'll display it again at the end. I'm Simon Thomas and I'm the Principal Ecologist at TMA. Within the ecology team here, we've worked on quite a number of projects involving biodiversity net gain assessments, and we're finding that this service is increasingly required for development projects. At TMA, as an environmental consultancy, we're equipped with the knowledge to advise and find technical solutions in a range of disciplines, including planning consultancy relating to trees, ecology, and landscape. We work with local governments and developers for small, medium and large developments and infrastructure projects throughout the southeast of England and beyond. We've developed this session to share our experience of biodiversity net gain, so we hope you find it valuable. We're working hard to create on-demand CPD so that you can access any of our presentations at a time that suits you. The links will be available on our website. So, what is or BNG is something that we're particularly interested in because we think it's the most important change for some decades to the expectations for new developments with regards to ecology. Although we've been hearing about biodiversity net gain for around 10 years now, it was in March 2019 that the government announced that through the new Environment Bill, biodiversity net gain would be made mandatory for all new developments in England. And this is why we think that it's important that everyone involved in designing or assessing new developments should have some familiarity with the concept of biodiversity net gain and to know where to find more information. And this is what I aim to deliver today as concisely as possible. So the main question I want to answer for you today is, what is biodiversity net gain? So put very simply, it's defined as development that leaves biodiversity in a better state than before. So to elaborate on that definition, we could first look at what is biodiversity. Essentially, biodiversity is the variety of all living things existing in a given place, including plants, animals, and fungi. I'll be referring a lot to habitats, which are basically different areas of vegetation and other features that provide opportunities for wildlife. This could include anything from an ancient woodland to an area of meadow, some scattered scrub and grass, right down to a patch of shrubbery. These all have biodiversity or ecological value to some extent. However, the biodiversity value of certain habitats is higher than others. The next question to answer is, what do we mean by net gain? So net gain essentially just means an improvement as a result of an activity taking place, particularly an improvement that's measurable or quantifiable so that you can clearly demonstrate that the result was indeed an improvement. In this case, we're talking about improvements to biodiversity as a result of development works or management of a site. So in that case, again, what is biodiversity net gain? Well, here's another government definition. The key phrases are measurable improvements and in association with development. So this means looking at the site before any development takes place and comparing it to the situation once the development has been completed. The biodiversity value of the site afterwards needs to be measurably better than beforehand. In some cases, it may be possible to use off-site areas to achieve this improvement, which I'll talk about shortly. It's worth noting that net gain means there has to be an improvement over and above just replacement or compensation for any damage or loss caused. This is what differentiates net gain from no net loss, which is another term you may have heard previously. So now development will be expected not just to have a neutral effect on biodiversity, but to actively achieve improvements. So these are the guidelines we need to refer to. They're designed to provide information for developers, local authorities, and ecological consultants. They're almost 200 pages long, but there are targeted chapters relevant to different roles, so nobody's expected to read them cover to cover. I'd advise you to have a look through and have a closer read of the parts that seem most relevant to your role. For developers, the relevant chapters are 5, 9, and 11, whereas chapters 3 and 4 provide guidance specifically for local planning authorities. So who does Biodiversity Net Gain apply to? Well, in March 2019, the government announced that through the new Environment Bill, Biodiversity Net Gain would be made mandatory for all new developments in England, other than very minor projects such as house extensions and permitted development, and at the other end of the scale, national infrastructure projects, which are dealt with separately. As you can see in the wording on the slide, the new legislation will require developments to deliver a 10% increase in habitat value on each site. And when is this due to come into force? Well, currently, as of February 2021, the Environment Bill is at the report stage in the House of Commons. So we're currently at stage R on the timeline. And when the bill achieves royal assent, there will be a transition period of 2 years. So it may be 2 or 3 years before Biodiversity Net Gain becomes mandatory nationwide. However, many local authorities already require Biodiversity Net Gain when assessing planning applications. A lot of local plans already include wording requiring Biodiversity Net Gain to be achieved in new developments. As an example, on this slide, you can see some excerpts from the East Hertfordshire District Plan 2018. As you can see, 3 of the policies include requirements for the use of a biodiversity metric, and they also make reference to a net gain in ecological units, a net gain in biodiversity, and improvements in the biodiversity value of the site. The National Planning Policy Framework, the NPPF, Section 15, also requires planning policies to provide net gains for biodiversity, although it doesn't stipulate a certain percentage or specify the use of a biodiversity metric. So how do we figure out if a development will achieve biodiversity net gain or not? I won't go into too much detail about how the calculations work, but it's worth understanding the general principles. As I mentioned before, biodiversity net gain is assessed by comparing the habitats in the site before and after development. So the first step is to have a survey of the site before any development-related activities. This is known as the baseline scenario. An ecologist would undertake this survey in order to classify each habitat type. But this would ordinarily be done anyway as part of a standard ecology survey, regardless of biodiversity net gain requirements. On the slide, you can see an example of such a survey. In this case, the site is covered mainly by hard standing, which is the grey areas, and bare ground, which is the spotty areas, with some trees and other vegetation around the edges. At TMA, we have developed a tablet-based GIS program to plot the different habitats on site accurately. We can then pass this spatial data on for collaboration with other members of the project team, particularly important for use in biodiversity net gain calculations. Following the survey, the ecologist will highlight the existing habitats of particular biodiversity value. This is a really important step because it starts the process of considering how biodiversity net gain can be designed into the development. The ecologist won't just highlight constraints, they'll also be able to identify opportunities to enhance the biodiversity value of the site in a locally relevant way. For example, by including new habitat suitable for a rare species found locally, or by using the site to create new connections between fragmented habitats in the surrounding landscape. It's these kinds of measures that turn the process from damage limitation into development that leaves biodiversity in a better state than before. If the most important existing habitats can be retained, then achieving biodiversity net gain will be much more straightforward. So in this example, the existing habitats are mainly around the edge of the site, for instance, hedgerows and woodland. Luckily, in this case, most of the site is of low value for biodiversity, and there are good opportunities to enhance these using well-placed planting within the development. So the next step is to design the development to avoid impacting biodiverse habitats as far as possible and include additional areas of habitat. The input of an ecologist on the design team is important during this stage to advise which habitats and features would be most appropriate to include. We collaborate closely with landscape architects, both within TMA and externally, as well as with the rest of the design team and other stakeholders as appropriate. It's vital that the requirement for biodiversity net gain is explicit in the design of the development, otherwise it's very unlikely to be achieved by accident. The developer mustn't underestimate the scale of what's required to achieve biodiversity net gain. In most cases, small areas of enhanced landscaping around the edge and in the corners of a development site won't be sufficient, unless the site was of extremely low biodiversity value to start with. Once the proposed landscaping for the site has been drafted, even if it's only very indicative, the concept of biodiversity units is used to quantify the value of each of the habitat areas present before and after the development. This is done using a calculator spreadsheet published by Natural England called the Biodiversity Metric 2.0. The calculator allocates a score to each habitat area by taking into account each habitat's vegetation type, size, condition, distinctiveness, and connectivity. Habitats that are good for wildlife score more highly per hectare than those with low ecological value. On this slide, I filled in some example habitats for a typical site with some grassland, brambles, and hard surfaces. The figure at the bottom in orange is just the total site area, not the biodiversity value of the habitats. Next, you go through the same process for the expected post-development habitats, in other words, the landscaping scheme. On this slide, I filled in some examples for landscaping, including some new woodland, a green roof, a pond, and some grassland. The total site area in orange remains the same. When this has been done, you can compare the pre-development score against the post-development score and see if there's a net loss or a net gain. On this slide, you can see that the baseline value of the site was 6.8 biodiversity units, and the post-development value is 7.79 units. This is an overall increase of 0.99 biodiversity units, which equates to a 14% biodiversity net gain. One key aspect of the calculator is that it gives the existing established habitats a much higher score than new habitats to be created because of the risks and timescales involved in habitat creation. Developers are often surprised that their proposed landscaping has scored so low compared to the score of existing baseline habitats. For instance, on a site we're working on currently, a small area of orchard, 0.1 hectares, is due to be removed to facilitate the development. However, using the calculator, the area of new orchard required to balance this impact is 0.3 hectares, 3 times the size. Of course, you can easily imagine that in many cases, this means that the impacts of habitat removal cannot possibly be compensated for within the development site itself, which is where off-site habitat creation or biodiversity offsetting may be used, which I'll come on to shortly. If the calculator shows that the development won't achieve the required level of biodiversity net gain, tweaks can be made to the design or layout to try and achieve the right number. As you can imagine, this process is best undertaken as early as possible, while there's still scope for modifications if needed. We can run indicative calculations at a very early stage using different site designs to gauge whether they seem likely to achieve the required level. However, although this single gain or loss calculation is very important, it isn't everything. There are some other important considerations that have to be included in the biodiversity net gain assessment. The first one is known as the functional value of the habitats within the site. This refers to the qualities of a habitat that make it important, which aren't incorporated into the numerical system. Essentially, functional value accounts for contextual information about the use of a site by wildlife over and above the values of the habitats when they're considered in isolation. For instance, a habitat within the site may be positioned so that it forms a vital dispersal corridor or a stepping stone for wildlife between two off-site habitats. Or a site which contains fairly ordinary habitats might provide a key foraging area for an important bat roost nearby. Or the presence of some fairly ordinary hawthorn scrub adjacent to a woodland may be more important because it enhances the quality of the woodland. Therefore, as well as achieving the required level of biodiversity net gain using the calculator, the development also needs to avoid having a negative impact on the functional qualities of the site, which can't be measured numerically. Another important aspect of biodiversity net gain is the category of irreplaceable habitats. These are a handful of habitat types which are deemed too important to be included in the biodiversity net gain system, because if they were to be removed, they couldn't successfully be replaced, and no amount of any other habitat type could compensate for their loss. The most common example given, and the one most likely to be present near development sites, is ancient woodland. But there are various other irreplaceable habitats, including blanket bog, limestone pavement, and salt marsh. If any irreplaceable habitats are present within the development site, the ecology survey will highlight these and they'll need to be preserved, otherwise there's very little chance of the development being granted planning permission, unless there are very exceptional circumstances. One question you might reasonably ask is whether the new biodiversity net gain requirements supersede or override the current legal protection of species such as bats and great-crested newts. And the answer is no, these species are still protected in the same way as ever. But you can imagine that in many cases, avoiding an impact on these species will go hand in hand with achieving biodiversity net gain. For instance, habitats that support protected species are also likely to score highly in the biodiversity metric, so it would be doubly worthwhile to avoid an impact on these habitats. Another important aspect of a biodiversity net gain system is the idea of the mitigation hierarchy. If this isn't properly applied throughout the design process, then planning permission may be refused, even for projects which demonstrate an overall net gain. The mitigation hierarchy essentially means that as a priority, the development must be designed to avoid impacts on existing biodiversity in the first place. This would usually mean retaining existing habitats wherever possible. All options to avoid impacts on valuable habitat should be explored and documented before settling for a design that does impact valuable habitats. The next step in the hierarchy is that where certain impacts cannot be completely avoided, they should at least be minimized. Only once impacts have first been avoided and then minimized, the design can move on to consider remediation or damage and restoration of habitats on site. And finally, once all the previous possibilities have been explored, any remaining impacts must be compensated for by creating alternative new habitats, either within the site or elsewhere. The creation of compensatory habitats outside the development site itself is sometimes known as offsetting. Biodiversity offsetting is a concept that's been talked about for a number of years and is already an option to compensate for habitat loss within development sites, but it's likely to become more commonplace once biodiversity net gain becomes mandatory, since many development sites simply won't be able to accommodate sufficient green space to achieve the required 10% biodiversity gain. In these cases, creating alternative habitats off-site may be necessary, although bear in mind that each step of the mitigation hierarchy must be followed first before off-site compensation can be considered. Biodiversity offsetting can take the form of habitat banking, where a third-party landowner can manage their land specifically to improve biodiversity, so that developers can then pay for a certain portion of that improvement to compensate for biodiversity losses within their development. Although this might seem like a convenient solution, the use of habitat banking is likely to be much more expensive than habitat retention or creation within the development site itself. Therefore, on-site measures should be explored as far as possible first. In many cases, a combination of on-site and off-site habitat creation may be appropriate. Whichever routes are used to secure biodiversity net gain, it's worth noting that a monitoring program has to be included and funded to ensure that new habitats are created and managed successfully, and also that habitats created need to be maintained for at least 30 years. Some new habitats wouldn't be expected to establish fully until some years after planting, which is fine, but the monitoring program would need to be designed to demonstrate this. So what does it mean for developments? Well, as I mentioned at the start of the session, we think that the requirements for biodiversity net gain are amongst the most important change for some decades to the expectations for new developments with regards to ecology and biodiversity. We do see it as a positive step, as it will level the playing field for developers, and it will mean that the biodiversity requirements are more clearly defined and clearly assessed. However, it is a big learning curve for everyone at the moment. Many developers are not yet familiar with biodiversity net gain and may not know what the expectations are for planning applications in their area. And in some cases, the requirements from local planning authorities are not entirely clear either. There is a tendency to underestimate the implications of biodiversity net gain, for instance, thinking that it can be met with the simple addition of traditional features like bird and bat boxes, which may sometimes have been deemed sufficient in the past. Or in many cases, ecology is something that is considered late in the design process, once the development has largely been designed and there's little scope for change. Meeting the requirements will be a significant challenge for a lot of developments. However, the challenge will be made less onerous if biodiversity net gain is considered by developers from the earliest stage possible in the process. To enable a development to meet the requirement for biodiversity net gain, the expectations need to be clearly established early on. For instance, is biodiversity net gain a mandatory element of the planning policy or something that should be achieved where possible? Is there an expectation of a 10% gain, or is it sufficient to achieve a more modest gain? And what level of evidence is expected to support the planning application? For instance, would full details of off-site offsetting be required, or can this be secured by a planning condition? In many cases, knowing the exact expectations at an early stage will help the developer to assess whether it's viable to develop a site whilst achieving the required level of biodiversity net gain. For sites with significant habitats present, developers will either need to account for generous soft landscaping areas or budget for high volumes of off-site compensation. Because of the way the calculator works, new habitats created are given a much lower score than habitats which were removed, so avoiding an impact on the existing habitats will be key wherever possible. The selection of sites for development should favour sites with very low existing ecological value. As I've mentioned, we recommend that an ecologist is involved early on in the process, even if it's just to give a brief desktop appraisal of a site at the feasibility stage, or to identify any key habitats that are likely to form constraints to the development. Thank you very much for listening, and I realise there's a lot of new information to take in, so I just want to finish by outlining our key advice regarding biodiversity net gain at this stage. Firstly, I recommend downloading the guidelines and taking a look at the sections most relevant to you. And once you've done this, discuss it with colleagues and other professionals to exchange knowledge and ideas with other people who will be faced with similar challenges. Find out what the expectations are for biodiversity net gain in your area. I mentioned that the Environment Bill is currently making progress, so it will be well worth looking out for updates about the progress of the bill. And bear in mind that some local authorities are already starting to require biodiversity net gain for new planning applications. Finally, as I mentioned, biodiversity net gain is a steep learning curve for pretty much everyone at the moment. With this in mind, we'd recommend that biodiversity net gain requirements are discussed at an early stage for any new developments. Confirming the requirements early on will help developers and design teams to take on the challenge of achieving biodiversity net gain. So thank you very much for viewing this session. I hope it's been useful for you, at least to give a brief introduction to the topic and to help you to start thinking about how it will affect your projects in the future. If you have any queries at any time, then do feel free to get in touch. My email address is on this slide. And of course, please do tell other people who may be interested about this recording so that they can view it themselves. We hope you'll join us for more of our online CPD sessions in the future. Thank you.